Story 1. I was camping alone in the Yorkshire Dales, one of those nights when everything's still. It's that quiet where you know something's off. My tent was set up a little off the trail, tucked between some rocks. I figured it'd be a peaceful night, just me and the stars. But peace doesn't last long when you're out there alone. I woke up around 2 a.m., disoriented at first, just blinking in the dark. Something wasn't right. The hairs on the back of my neck were standing up, and I had that gut feeling, you know? The one where you're not sure what's wrong, but you know something is. At first, I thought it was just a fox or some other creature, maybe a badger or a rabbit scratching at the tent. But then it got louder, the sound of something scraping against the fabric, slow, deliberate, and way too close. I could hear it as clear as day, the nails or claws or whatever it was, digging into the tent like it was trying to get in. I froze, listening. My heart started pounding. I told myself it was just an animal, that it couldn't be anything else. But the scratching didn't stop. It kept going, getting louder and closer. It wasn't just scratching anymore, it was scraping, like something dragging its nails down the side of the tent. My breath hitched. I could feel my pulse in my ears, drowning out every other sound. The silence in between the scrapes was suffocating. The tent was too still, too quiet. I kept telling myself it was just a wild animal, but it didn't feel like one. The noise was too precise, too calculated. Then the tent started to move. The side bulged inwards, like something was pushing against it. I could feel the pressure on the fabric, the weight of whatever it was pressing on the other side. The scraping sound didn't stop. It was right there now, right at the edge of the tent, like whatever was on the other side was scraping along the poles themselves. My heart was in my throat now. I couldn't breathe. I had to move, but I was paralyzed, staring at the bulging side of the tent. The pointy shape of whatever it was pressing against the fabric. I could see the outline now, faint but distinct, poking through the tent like something with sharp edges. A flash of panic hit me. This wasn't just an animal. Whatever it was too big, too deliberate. The shape didn't move like a creature's. It was unnerving the way it stayed in place, pushing against the fabric, not shifting or rustling the way a normal animal would. It was like it was watching me. I couldn't move, couldn't think. My thoughts were a blur of fight or flight. I should have done something, grabbed the knife from my bag, screamed anything. But I was frozen, every muscle in my body screaming at me to get out of there. The scraping noise intensified. I could hear the fabric stretching, almost tearing. And then there was a sudden thump, like something heavy slamming into the ground outside. The side of the tent buckled completely, and I could feel the pointy object, sharp, cold, pressing through the fabric. It scraped against the skin of my arm, and I flinched, jerking back, too terrified to even scream. I didn't think. I didn't grab anything. I just bolted. I shoved my body into the tent door and tore it open, crawling out into the cold night, my breath coming in gasps. I didn't look back. I didn't care what it was or whether it was still following me. All that mattered was putting as much distance between me and that tent as possible. I ran, not caring about the terrain, not caring about the dark. My head was pounding, my legs burning, but I didn't stop. The forest was thick with shadows, and the only sound was my ragged breathing and the crunch of leaves beneath my boots. My mind was a blur. All I could think about was the tent, the scraping, the cold sharpness pressing into the fabric. I didn't look behind me once. I couldn't bring myself to. When I finally reached the edge of the forest, I stopped, gasping for air. I was shaking all over, my body trembling like I was freezing to death. But it wasn't the cold, it was the fear. I sat there for what felt like hours trying to calm myself down, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, still watching, still waiting. I didn't go back to the tent. I didn't even think about it. I wasn't sure if I'd left anything behind, or if it had even been my tent anymore. I didn't care. I wasn't going back. Whatever it was, I wasn't going near it. Not ever again. I spent the rest of the night in the forest, too scared to sleep, too terrified to even sit still for long. When the sun finally came up, I didn't waste any time. I packed up what little I had with me, barely even looking at the spot where my tent had been. I left the Dales early that morning, not stopping until I was miles away. Some things you just can't explain. Story 2. It was a cold night in early spring, the kind where the air still had a bite to it, but you knew it would warm up by morning. I was camped out with my Cub Scout pack at a site in southeast London. It was a routine weekend, just the kids and a couple of leaders, like we'd done 100 times before. We set up the tents, made the campfire, roasted marshmallows, and tucked in for the night. Around 2 a.m., I was in my sleeping bag, drifting in and out of sleep. It had been a long day, and I was exhausted. The only sound was the wind rustling through the trees. Then it came. The scream. It wasn't just any scream. It was the kind of scream that sent a chill down your spine, one that made your blood run cold. It was loud, unearthly, like something was being torn apart, and it was coming from the boys' tent. I bolted upright, heart racing. The scream didn't stop, just this guttural, frantic shriek, as if someone was in the most primal kind of pain. I didn't think. I just ran. I didn't even grab my jacket. I burst out of my tent, bare feet slapping against the cold ground, my mind screaming at me that something terrible was happening. The scream had echoed for what felt like forever, but by the time I reached the row of domed tents where the boys were sleeping, it stopped. It was dead silent. I stood there, panting in the dark, scanning the row of tents. I expected to see something. A boy being dragged out. Something. But there was nothing. No sound. No movement. It was as if the scream had never happened. I glanced around, making sure I wasn't missing something. The other leaders were already with me now, their faces pale, eyes wide with confusion and fear. We all stood there, the tension hanging in the air. They hadn't heard it. Not even the other boys had woken up. How could they not hear that? One of the leaders whispered. It was like they hadn't even stirred. I didn't have an answer. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. We quietly checked the tents, starting with the one closest to the scream. The boys were all there, all 4 of them curled up in their sleeping bags, oblivious. There wasn't a mark on them, no sign of anything unusual. We checked each tent, one by one, and the result was the same. All the boys were there, sleeping soundly, completely unaware of the blood-curdling scream that had ripped through the night. "What the hell?" I muttered. It didn't make sense. We were all there, listening to that scream, and yet no one had been harmed. There was nothing, just an unsettling, eerie silence. It was like the scream had never even happened. I glanced at the other leaders, each of us sharing the same confused and worried expression. "What do we do now?" I asked. "We need to get them up," one of the leaders said, his voice shaky. "They need to know something happened." But how could I explain it? How could I explain to a bunch of kids that something horrible had just happened? But they hadn't seen it, hadn't heard it, hadn't experienced it. The other boys were still asleep, not a care in the world. There was nothing we could do, so we waited. We stood there, in the middle of the dark, waiting for the first rays of daylight to show us that it was all just a bad dream. But the sun didn't bring any clarity. Morning came, and everything seemed normal. The kids woke up, had breakfast, went about their usual camp activities like nothing had ever happened. We didn't talk about it. We didn't ask anyone if they had heard the scream. It didn't seem right to bring it up. It felt wrong. But the thing that bothered me the most, the thing I can't shake, is that I still don't know who screamed. Not a single one of those boys ever admitted it. Not one of them ever mentioned waking up in the middle of the night, hearing something that should have sent them running. The scream had come from inside their tents, but none of them acted like they'd even heard it. What was it? Why didn't the other kids hear it? Why didn't any of the boys wake up, especially after hearing a sound like that? And who screamed? I never found out, and I never want to. Story 3. I was 13, maybe 14, old enough to be at a camp for a week with a bunch of other kids, but still young enough for everything to feel big and scary. This wasn't your typical summer camp. It wasn't all sing-alongs and s'mores. We were out in the woods on this kind of isolated piece of land where everything just felt off. It wasn't that anyone said anything. It was the silence. The trees were so tall, they made everything feel boxed in. The tents were these platform ones, like wooden floors with a thin tarp over them. Nothing about it felt comforting. I couldn't explain it at the time, but something felt wrong. That night I couldn't sleep. It was probably around 4 a.m., maybe later. Everyone else in the tent was out cold, snoring, but I just couldn't shut my brain off. The air was thick, like it was holding something back, like it was trying to smother me. I sat up. The faint light from the moon filtered through the slats of the tent. I remember staring at the ground, thinking about how dark it was outside, and then wondering if I was the only one awake. It wasn't like I heard anything. No sounds of animals, no rustling of leaves, just stillness. It was the kind of quiet that made you feel like something was watching, but I couldn't tell if I was imagining it. Then I heard a sound, a footstep. It wasn't from inside the tent. It was from outside, a soft, slow step. Like someone was trying to be quiet, but wasn't doing a very good job of it. I froze, holding my breath. I thought it was probably one of the camp counselors. Maybe they were checking on us. But there was no rustling of the tent flaps. Nothing. The step came again. I don't know what made me do it, but I slid my feet out of the sleeping bag and onto the floor. I crept to the edge of the tent, careful not to make a sound. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I peeked out through the gap in the canvas. Nothing. Not a thing. I don't know why, but I unzipped the flap and stepped outside. The night air was cold, colder than I expected. I felt it hit my skin in a way that made me want to pull the collar of my jacket up. The ground was damp beneath my bare feet. I don't know why I didn't put my shoes on, but I just didn't. The camp was dead quiet. Nothing was stirring. No sounds of the other kids in the tents. No wind, no nothing. The trees looked like shadows, like they were closing in around us. And then I saw it. A light. It was far off, way back in the woods. Just a small, glowing spot, like someone was holding a lantern or something. It moved, weaving through the trees. But it didn't move like a person would. It wasn't jerky or uneven. It glided. It was like the light was floating, hovering through the trees. I don't know why, but I started walking toward it. My feet felt heavier with each step. I remember telling myself it was nothing, that it was probably just another counselor out there doing something stupid. But the farther I walked, the more the feeling of wrongness washed over me. The air felt thick again, like it was pressing in on me, making it harder to breathe. Then I saw something that made my stomach twist. The light was closer now, maybe 30 yards away. But it wasn't a lantern, it was something else. The glow was soft but unnaturally bright, like it was pulsing in the night. It wasn't steady, it was shifting, almost breathing, like it had its own rhythm. I stopped walking. Something in my gut told me to turn around, to run, but I couldn't. I couldn't move. That's when I heard a voice. It wasn't loud. It wasn't even a whisper. It was just this soft, breathy sound, like someone was standing right behind me, talking in a language I couldn't understand. I don't know how I knew, but it felt like it was coming from the light itself. Like the light was speaking, but not with words. Just this low hum, like a vibration I could feel in my chest. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and that's when I realized something. I was barefoot in the forest, alone, in the middle of nowhere, and I wasn't supposed to be here. I tried to move, but my feet were glued to the ground. My chest felt tight, like I couldn't get enough air in my lungs. My heart was beating so fast it felt like it might explode. I couldn't take it anymore. I turned and I ran. I didn't think about it. I didn't think about where I was going. I just ran, barefoot, through the woods, dodging branches and stumbling over rocks. I didn't dare look behind me. I could feel it, that thing, that presence. I could feel it following me, even if I couldn't see it. Somehow I made it back to the camp. My heart was hammering in my chest. I don't know how long I'd been running, but when I hit the edge of the camp, everything felt different. The air wasn't thick anymore. The trees didn't feel so oppressive. I didn't stop to think about it. I didn't even try to make sense of what had happened. I just ran to my tent and dove inside, pulled the flap down, and curled up under my sleeping bag. I didn't sleep the rest of the night, and I didn't tell anyone. Not then, not ever. But I knew. I knew what I'd seen, and I knew I wasn't going back out there. Not ever again. I don't think I ever went back to that camp. Story 4. It was late afternoon when we finally rolled into Jefferson National Forest, up a dirt road that seemed to stretch forever. We'd passed a few strange sights along the way, but we were too excited about our trip to really care. I remember the coal factory that looked like it hadn't seen a soul in years. The sign about the 62 days since an on-site incident made me laugh nervously, and the group of people standing around a burning plastic bin in the middle of nowhere, their faces hidden in shadow. It felt off, sure, but nothing I couldn't brush off. After all, we were here to camp, not get caught up in some random small-town mystery. By the time we reached White Rock's campground, the sky was turning that deep shade of blue that makes you feel like the world's about to swallow you whole. There were no other cars around, not a single person, just trees, big, thick trees in the empty campsite. It felt like we were on a forgotten road trip, miles from anyone. We drove around the campground looking for signs of life, but there was nothing. It felt like the place had been abandoned. 30 sights, not a soul to be seen. I looked at my friend and we just shrugged. "Let's set up," I said. She nodded, but I saw that look in her eyes. She was just as creeped out as I was. Neither of us wanted to admit it. We didn't want to sound like we were overreacting. I mean, we were seasoned campers, right? We picked a random spot, got out of the car, and instantly felt the weight of the silence. It was thick, almost suffocating. No birds, no animals, nothing. It was too quiet. The woods felt like they were holding their breath. I went to work setting up a fire. I was trying to keep my focus, trying to pretend like everything was fine. My friend, she was handling the tent, but every now and then she would pause, looking around. "You hear that?" she asked after a while. I stopped what I was doing. I'd been hearing it too. Or more accurately, I hadn't been hearing anything. Just a dead kind of silence, the type you only find in the middle of nowhere. "Probably just the wind," I said, though I didn't believe it. I could feel it though. Someone was watching us. I don't know how to explain it, but there was something off about the place. My friend was nervous too, I could tell, but she was good at hiding it. I glanced at her as she bent over to unpack the sleeping bags. She kept looking over her shoulder, her face pale in the dim light. By the time the fire was crackling and the tent was set up, night had fully fallen. The world around us was pure blackness, except for the little flicker of the flames. I grabbed my headlamp and turned it on every once in a while, scanning the woods. Nothing. Just trees. We sat around the fire trying to push past the tension. She pulled out a book to read aloud. A way to distract ourselves, I guess. I don't know how long we sat there, but at some point the feeling got worse. The silence had become thick, like the air was closing in on us. I was getting that feeling again. The one where you know someone's there, but you can't see them. I glanced around, shining my headlamp in every direction, but all I saw were shadows. The trees looked like twisted black shapes in the distance. My heartbeat started to speed up. "You good?" my friend asked, her voice sounding a little too high-pitched for her usual calm. "Yeah, just checking the woods." I wasn't lying. I was checking for movement. I could feel it now. Someone or something was out there, just out of sight, watching us. The fire crackled. It was the only sound besides the soft rustling of the leaves, but it was so quiet, so unnaturally quiet, that every little sound felt like it was amplified 100 times. And then I heard it, a snap, a twig breaking, but it didn't sound like it came from the usual spots in the woods. It was right behind us. I froze. I turned my headlamp off. For a second, I thought maybe it was my imagination, but then I heard another snap, closer this time. I looked at my friend. Her eyes were wide and she was staring straight ahead, frozen too. I wanted to say something, but nothing came out. My throat felt dry. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. I nodded. "Yeah, I heard it." We both sat there in silence, not daring to move. My mind was racing, thinking about what to do. What could I do? Then out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. A shadow, fast and low to the ground. It moved between the trees, just at the edge of the firelight, then disappeared. I whipped my head around, my heart in my throat. I shone the light in that direction, but there was nothing. No one. "It's just an animal," I said, though I didn't believe it, but she didn't respond. She was staring into the darkness, her face pale. The tension in the air grew so thick, it felt like it was pressing down on us. "Let's pack up," I said, my voice barely a whisper. She didn't even hesitate. We grabbed our stuff, hands shaking, trying to act normal, trying to stay calm, but we both knew we were getting the hell out of there. Just as we were about to leave, there was another snap. This time it was closer, right behind us. I spun around, my heart racing, but there was nothing. Not a sound, just the flickering firelight in the dark, empty woods. We didn't speak as we jumped into the car. I didn't start the engine right away, just sat there, staring at the woods, waiting for something to show itself. But nothing did. We didn't look back as we drove away. Not until we reached the main road, far from the woods, did we breathe again. And even then, I couldn't shake the feeling. That night, I still couldn't sleep. We never went back to that campground. Story 5. I was about 12 or 13 when this happened. My buddy and I were camping in my backyard, just 50 feet from the house, right up against some thick woods. It was one of those summer nights where the air feels heavy, thick with humidity, the kind that sticks to your skin. The trees rustled in the wind, but it didn't feel right, like something was off. My friend and I were talking about who knows what in the tent, just goofing off when the first sound hit us. It wasn't a rustle, not like an animal scurrying around. It was more like something moving through the underbrush, dragging itself along the ground. Slow, heavy, too deliberate. We both stopped mid-sentence. I looked at my friend, but he didn't need to say anything. He heard it too. My heart was already beating faster. I could feel the hairs on my neck standing up. It wasn't just an animal, I could tell. The sound was closer now, coming from the edge of the woods right next to our tent. The darkness outside seemed to press in, thick like a blanket. Then it came, a sound that made every muscle in my body freeze, a snarling, bone-rattling growl. It was so close it made the fabric of the tent vibrate. My stomach dropped straight into my feet, and I could barely breathe. It lasted for a few seconds, long enough to make every single thought in my head turn to panic. I couldn't think, couldn't move. My friend and I both went completely still. We didn't even look at each other. We were frozen, like if we moved, whatever was outside would know we were there. Then, nothing. Just silence. Not even the wind. For a long minute, neither of us spoke. Then my friend, he's the kind of guy who's always got something to say, he whispers, "It's probably a buck. A big one. Probably gonna stick its antler right through the tent." I was still shaking. "A buck?" I whispered back. "Do they make that noise?" He doesn't answer right away. "I don't know. It sounded like something bigger." I didn't know what to say to that. A buck I could handle. A bear? Maybe, but this wasn't a bear. It didn't sound like anything I'd ever heard before. That growl, it wasn't right. Nothing about it was right. We both knew the woods behind my house weren't really normal woods. We had hiked there plenty of times, but there was something about them that felt different, like they didn't belong. Some nights you could feel them staring at you, like the trees were watching. But this felt worse. This felt wrong. And we were sitting in a tent in the middle of it, a little too close to the woods for comfort. The air felt thick, like it was pressing in on us. I could feel my friend's breathing, shallow and quick, but I couldn't take my eyes off the tent door. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was out there was just waiting for us to do something. Then my friend said it, his voice almost too low to hear. "What if it's a bear?" The thought hit me like a punch in the gut. A bear, right outside our tent. What were we gonna do? We weren't even armed. No knives, no nothing. I felt sick. "What if it's not a bear?" I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "What if it's something else?" My friend didn't reply. He just stared at the tent door too, both of us waiting for the next sound to come. The silence stretched on, the kind of silence that makes everything worse. Every little noise, even the rustling of the trees, felt like it could be the thing coming for us. We were both wide-eyed, our breaths shallow. My friend was shaking, his fingers gripping the sides of the tent like he was ready to run. I didn't know what to do. I thought about the house just 50 feet away. Should we run for it? But what if it was already too late? "Let's get out of here," my friend finally said, voice cracking. "We'll make a run for the house, but we need to be quick." I nodded, too scared to argue. But how could we get out of here without whatever was out there hearing us? We devised a plan. I'd peek out first. Just a quick look to see if it was clear. If it was clear, we'd run. But if it wasn't, if it was still out there, waiting for us, we'd have to figure something else out. I remember how my fingers shook as I slowly unzipped the flap of the tent. My heart was hammering in my chest, so loud I was sure whatever was out there could hear it. My friend's breath was hot and quick beside me. I peeked my head out. The world outside was black. No moon, no stars, just pitch darkness, and I couldn't see anything. My eyes scanned the woods looking for any movement. The ground was still. The trees didn't move. Nothing. I waited, holding my breath. No sounds, no growls, just the stillness of the night. "Clear," I whispered. "Are you sure?" he whispered back, barely audible. "I'm sure. Let's go." We both slid out of the tent. I couldn't look back. I just ran as fast as I could, my legs burning, my chest aching with each step. My friend was right beside me, but I didn't dare slow down. I just kept running, the house never feeling further away. I reached the back door, hands fumbling for the knob, the sound of my friend right behind me. He grabbed my arm, yanked me inside. We slammed the door shut, gasping for breath. Neither of us spoke for a while. We just stood there staring at each other, trying to make sense of what had just happened. But we didn't say anything about it. We didn't have to. Whatever was out there, it didn't feel like anything natural, and we both knew it. But we never went back out there, not at night. We never talked about it again. Story 6, I live in eastern Kentucky, about an hour outside Pikeville. It's the kind of place where the hills feel alive, and you grow up hearing stories about the things that walk the woods at night. Most folks shrug them off, but if you've spent enough time out there, you know better. I don't claim to understand what I saw that night, if I even saw anything at all, but I'll tell it like it happened. You can believe it or not. It was late September, a crisp Friday evening. Me, my buddy Eric, his girlfriend Sarah, and her friend Rachel decided to do some camping. Eric knew a spot tucked way back in the hills, about a mile off an old logging trail. It wasn't an official campground, just a clearing near a creek with a ring of stones somebody had used for a fire pit. "Perfect," he said. We parked Eric's truck where the trail started and hiked in, the sun dipping lower as we went. The air smelled like damp leaves and pine, and the only sound was the crunch of our boots. When we got to the spot, it was already dusk. We set up our tents, a two-person for Eric and Sarah, and another for Rachel and me. By the time we had a fire going, the stars were out. The night was calm. We cooked hot dogs on sticks and laughed over dumb stories. Around 11, the fire had burned down to glowing coals. The chill was setting in, so we decided to call it a night. I remember zipping myself into my sleeping bag, hearing the faint trickle of the creek, and falling asleep almost instantly. When I woke up, it was morning. Bright sunlight was leaking through the fabric of the tent, and I could hear birds chirping. I rolled over and noticed Rachel wasn't in her sleeping bag. Figured she'd gone to pee or something. I unzipped the tent and stepped out. That's when I froze. The woods, everything behind our campsite, was flattened. Not in a way that looked natural. The trees, the brush, even some of the larger rocks. It was like a bulldozer had plowed straight through. The line started maybe 100 feet back, and from there, it just kept going, deeper into the forest. I looked around for Eric and Sarah, and they were coming out of their tent, looking just as confused as me. "What the hell is this?" Eric muttered, rubbing the back of his neck. "I don't know," I said. "Did you guys hear anything last night?" They both shook their heads. Sarah looked pale, her arms crossed over her chest like she was trying to keep herself together. That's when it hit me. Where was Rachel? "Rachel!" I called out. Nothing. Eric and I started checking the area. Her sleeping bag was still inside the tent, but her boots were gone. We shouted her name again and again, but the woods swallowed our voices. Maybe she went back to the truck, Sarah said, her voice trembling. She wouldn't just leave, I said, but I grabbed my boots and started toward the trail anyway. Eric followed me. Sarah stayed behind, saying she didn't want to leave the campsite in case Rachel came back. The walk to the truck felt like a dream, or maybe a nightmare. The whole forest felt wrong, silent except for our footsteps. No birds, no squirrels, not even the sound of the creek. It was like the world had paused, waiting for something. When we reached the truck, Rachel wasn't there. Her phone was still in the cup holder. Eric tried starting the truck, but it wouldn't turn over. Battery was dead, though it had been fine the day before. I felt a weight in my chest. Something wasn't right. We turned back toward the campsite, walking faster this time. I don't know if it was paranoia or what, but I felt like we were being watched. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone or something behind us. Nothing was there, but the feeling wouldn't go away. When we got back to the clearing, Sarah was standing by the fire pit, staring at the ground. "You guys need to see this," she said, her voice shaky. She pointed to the dirt just outside the fire ring. There were tracks, big ones, like an animal's, but nothing I'd ever seen before. The prints were long and wide, with what looked like claw marks at the tips. They were deep too, like whatever made them was heavy. The trail led from the flattened forest, through our campsite, and then veered off into the woods on the other side. "What the hell is this?" Eric said again, but nobody had an answer. "Where's Rachel?" Sarah asked, her voice cracking. I didn't know what to say. My stomach was in knots. I wanted to run, but where? The truck wouldn't start, and hiking out through those woods felt like a death sentence. That's when we heard it, a low guttural sound, like a growl but deeper. It came from the direction of the crushed trees. We all froze, staring into the woods, but we couldn't see anything. Then the growl came again, louder this time, closer. "Get in the tent," Eric hissed, grabbing Sarah by the arm. "We can't," I started, but he cut me off. "Just do it." We piled into Eric and Sarah's tent, zipping it shut and huddling together like that thin layer of nylon would keep us safe. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. Outside, the growl turned into something else, almost like a howl, but twisted, like it didn't belong to any animal I'd ever heard. Footsteps followed, slow and deliberate, crunching the leaves outside. None of us breathed. The sound stopped just outside the tent. For what felt like an eternity, there was silence. Then whatever it was let out a sharp, ear-splitting screech. And then, nothing. When we finally worked up the courage to unzip the tent, the sun was almost down. The prints were gone, along with any sign of Rachel. We hiked out that night, using our phone flashlights to light the way. We didn't stop until we reached a main road, where a farmer eventually picked us up. I don't go into the woods anymore, and I never saw Rachel again. Story 7. A few years ago, my friend invited me to stay with him at this old campsite he'd gone to every year with his family. It wasn't a place I had ever been, but it sounded like the kind of trip where you fish, swim, and just hang out. So I agreed. I figured it'd be a nice way to spend a weekend away from everything. It was the usual camping stuff at first. We fished, caught a few trout, swam in the lake, and sat around the campfire. Nothing special, but it was fun. The fire crackled as we roasted marshmallows and made s'mores, and everyone was in good spirits. The whole group, maybe 40 people, was spread out across tents, with only me and my friends still up, sitting by the fire. I don't remember exactly when it started, but it was well after midnight, probably close to 2 in the morning. At first it was quiet, just the fire popping and the rustling of trees. Then I heard it, a whistle, high-pitched, not sharp, but long. It sounded like the Hunger Games call, like the one they use in the movies. It came from somewhere deep in the forest, distant but clear. I shrugged it off, thinking maybe someone was just messing around. I've been known to whistle myself, and I did it all the time. So without even thinking, I gave the return whistle. I figured if it was someone out there, they'd hear it and know we were out here too. Then it came again, the whistle, that same drawn-out note, same place, same tone. This time it felt a little stranger. I could almost feel the air around me shift when it happened. Maybe it was the isolation, or maybe the night just seemed too still, but I whistled back again. After a few more seconds, the whistles didn't come back as the same note anymore. They shifted. It was like they started playing around with the pitch. Random notes, almost like a melody, like someone was trying to talk to me through music. I laughed under my breath, a little annoyed. I was good at whistling, sure, but I was starting to feel a weird chill, like whoever this was playing some game with me. And that's when I really decided to go out and find them. I stood up. My friend, already a little tipsy from the beers we'd had earlier, didn't notice me leave at first. But I wasn't being quiet. I figured I'd get closer, maybe catch whoever it was off guard, and see if I could stop them. I didn't even grab a flashlight. Barefoot like an idiot, I just stepped off into the woods. It was pitch black out there. The trees stood tall and thick, and the air felt damp, heavy. I walked slow, trying to listen carefully to the whistles. They were still faint, but getting closer. After what felt like forever, 20 minutes maybe, I stopped and tried to focus. The whistling had stopped. I hadn't heard it in a few minutes, but I figured they had to be close. My eyes adjusted to the darkness a little, but not enough to see clearly. Then just as I was starting to turn around and call it quits, I heard something else. A movement, someone shifting. I wasn't sure if it was just me, or maybe a bear or something, but I tensed up. I wasn't alone. I turned slowly, staying still, and sure enough, just up ahead, in a little clearing by the lake, I saw them. 3 kids. They were sitting on some fallen logs, just staring out at the water. The moonlight reflected off the lake, and for a second, I thought they might just be other campers. But something was off. I called to them, "Hey, you guys whistling earlier?" No response. They didn't even turn around. I walked closer, a little hesitant now. I mean, we were out in the middle of nowhere, and who the hell were these kids? They didn't look like any of the people from the campsite. Their clothes were odd, not like the usual camping gear you'd expect. One of them had a red hoodie, but it looked faded and old, like it had been washed too many times. The other 2 were wearing similar ragged clothes, like something you'd find in a thrift shop. I couldn't shake the weird feeling, like they weren't supposed to be there. I called out again, louder this time. "Hey, you guys hear me? I was following the whistling." Still nothing. They just sat there, stiff, staring at the lake. It was eerie, like they were frozen in place. Are you lost or something?" I asked, stepping closer. But they didn't respond. Not even a twitch. It felt wrong. There was this feeling in the pit of my stomach. You know that feeling when you're walking through an unfamiliar place and someone's watching you? It was that, but stronger. I didn't want to get any closer, so I stopped about 2 feet away from them. My heart was pounding now. I tried again. "You guys, what's your names? Where are your parents?" Nothing. They were just sitting there, staring at the water, not even blinking. It was like they couldn't hear me, and the silence was suffocating. I glanced behind me, back toward camp, and noticed the trees seemed denser, the path darker. I felt this urge to get out of there fast, but I wasn't sure why. It wasn't like I felt I was in danger, but the situation felt so strange, so wrong, that I couldn't stay any longer. Without saying anything else, I turned around and hurried back the way I came. When I got back to camp, my friend was standing by the fire, his eyes wide. "Where the hell did you go? I thought you were dead." I barely answered him, just nodded, still feeling that knot in my stomach. I didn't want to tell him about the kids, and I definitely didn't want to talk about the whistling anymore. The whole atmosphere felt off, like something I couldn't explain, and I didn't want to. But when we sat down, there was no more whistling. It was like it had never happened. Everything was dead quiet. And the weirdest thing? Nobody else mentioned it the whole time we were there. No one even seemed to notice. It's like whatever happened that night just vanished. To this day, I don't know who those kids were, but I'm not going back to that campsite again. Not for any reason. Story 8. I'd been out there alone for about an hour, just me and the fire. The rest of the family was inside the cabin, probably asleep by now. It was one of those quiet nights. No wind, no animals, just the fire crackling. The stars were so bright I could almost see everything around me without a flashlight. You know how sometimes when it's that quiet, It feels like the whole world is holding its breath. Yeah, that's what it felt like. I wasn't really thinking about anything. I'd finished my beer, and the empty bottle sat beside me in the dirt. My thoughts drifted, but then, out of nowhere, I started to feel it. The feeling like someone's watching me. It wasn't like a random thought that I could ignore. No, this was different. It was like a weight on the back of my neck. Something about the way the air felt, thick and still, made me uneasy. The fire was too small to push away the shadows from the woods. I tried shaking it off. It was probably nothing, right? Just the isolation, the darkness. But the feeling didn't go away. It was like something was out there, in the blackness, just beyond the reach of the firelight. I stood up, figuring maybe I was just too damn tired or something. I started walking toward the cabin, but before I could take more than a few steps, I froze. I don't know why. It was like my body just stopped listening to my brain. And then I saw it. There was a dog. I don't know how the hell it got so close, but there it was, standing just feet away from where I'd been sitting. The firelight hit its fur, and I could see it clearly. Black coat with gray spots on its back, one of those hunting dogs. But its eyes, they were fixed on me, like it was studying me, sniffing the air, like it was deciding whether I was worth investigating or not. My heart dropped straight into my stomach. It didn't make a sound, not a single step, not a rustle in the leaves, not even a breath. It was just standing there, staring. The worst part was, I couldn't tell how long it had been there. It might have been there the whole time. It didn't move, didn't even seem to blink. I wanted to yell, but I couldn't. It felt like my throat was tied up. I don't know how long we stood like that. Me, frozen in place, the dog just staring. I think my pulse was louder than the fire. I could barely breathe. I felt like I was being suffocated. Then, without any warning, the dog snorted, like it was just getting a whiff of me. It sniffed the air, but its eyes never left mine. And then, just as quietly as it had appeared, it turned and walked back toward the woods. It wasn't fast, wasn't even really moving in a hurry. It just casually walked off into the trees, vanishing into the darkness like it had never been there at all. I don't even know how I moved after that. My legs were shaky, like they'd turned to jelly. I stumbled back toward the cabin, not daring to look over my shoulder. I couldn't get inside fast enough. I locked the door behind me, and I swear I could still feel its eyes on me, even though I couldn't see it anymore. I didn't say anything to anyone the next morning. I figured maybe I had been seeing things. Maybe the dark had gotten to me. Or maybe it was some local stray dog that wandered in. But that's not what felt off. There's a lot of woods out there, more than most people realize. I don't know what lives in them when no one's around, but I've got my suspicions. Story 9. I was camping in northern BC with a group of friends about 9 years ago. We were out there in the middle of nowhere, maybe 50 kilometers from any town or store. It was pitch black out, and we were sitting around a fire just hanging out, drinking beers and listening to tunes. Everything was chill. We were far enough from civilization that the silence felt unnatural. There was just this emptiness in the air, like the world was holding its breath. It was around 10 p.m. when things started to get weird. I remember it clearly. Someone pointed across the lake. The lake itself was pretty big, maybe 5 kilometers across. On the far side, there was this tiny, distant light. At first, we all thought it was another camper, maybe some folks who had set up further down the shore, like us trying to enjoy the peace of the wilderness. So we grabbed a flashlight and started flashing it, 2 quick bursts, trying to get their attention. Then to our surprise, the light across the lake flashed back, 2 times. Same pattern. We all kind of looked at each other like, all right, this is cool. There's someone else out here. We flashed the light again, but this time 3 times. That's when things got strange. The light on the other side of the lake flashed back at us, but this time it was different. It wasn't just mimicking us. The intensity of the light increased, almost like it was responding to us, like it was showing off. For a split second, I thought it was just some kind of weird reflection, or maybe some other camper messing with us. But then, just as quickly, the light moved. It zipped across the entire side of the mountain, from one side of the peak to the other, like it was just, floating through the air, moving faster than anything should be able to. I could hear my friends around the fire, all of us muttering confused stuff like, "What the hell was that? And is someone out there?" The light stopped on the opposite side of the lake, like it was now hovering over a different peak, about halfway across. It didn't just sit there quietly, it started flashing again, but this time it was erratic, like it was almost teasing us, like it was waiting for us to do something. My heart was pounding. I don't know why, but I had this feeling in my gut that told me something was wrong. That wasn't just another camper, that wasn't a reflection, it wasn't anything normal. This was something else. Someone suggested we should hike over there, maybe try and meet whoever it was. I think it was just nervous excitement, but I didn't want to go anywhere near it. The whole group was starting to get uneasy. The air felt charged, like something was building up. And then, this is the part that still gets me. The light grew so bright that it was blinding. For a second, I thought the mountain was on fire, and I felt this wave of heat wash over me. Even though we were still sitting by the fire, freezing our asses off. That's when I just snapped. I turned my flashlight off and got up. I remember stumbling away from the fire, kind of falling into my tent, and just yanking the flap shut behind me. My friends were calling out to me, but I couldn't bring myself to go back out there. I crawled into my sleeping bag and pulled it over my head, trying to block out everything. I thought if I just went to sleep, everything would go away. That's how scared I was. Scared enough to hide in my own damn sleeping bag like a little kid. I don't even remember falling asleep. I guess I must have passed out from the fear. I woke up sometime in the middle of the night. My heart was still racing, but the tent was quiet. I heard nothing. No one was talking, no one was laughing. The fire outside was long gone, nothing but smoldering ashes. Then as I lay there trying to catch my breath, I thought I heard something. It was a soft sound, like something scraping against the ground. I froze. It was right outside my tent. I had to look. I couldn't not look. I slowly unzipped the tent just a little, enough to see what was going on. The moonlight was faint, but enough to make out the ground around me. My stomach sank when I saw them. At least half a dozen toads, maybe more, scattered in a perfect circle around my tent. Big ones. Their skin was bloated, their eyes hollow. I don't even know how to explain it. They weren't just dead, they were decayed. The bodies were like they'd been lying there for days, even though I'd just gone to sleep a few hours ago. I didn't touch them, didn't dare get any closer, but I remember staring at them, paralyzed, thinking how fucking impossible it was. How the hell did these things get here? My hands were shaking as I zipped the tent back up, my head spinning. I don't know if it was the fear or just the absolute wrongness of everything that had happened that night, but I couldn't stay out there anymore. The light, the movement, the feeling in the air. All of it was wrong. There was something else out there, something we weren't supposed to see. Story 10. We'd been hiking for about a half hour, nothing too intense, just enough to get away from the noise and bustle of civilization. The trail wasn't long, but it was quiet, and that's exactly what we wanted. The kind of quiet that makes your ears ring. The kind that feels like no one's around for miles. We found a spot by the stream, a little clearing, and set up camp. The sun was dipping below the trees and the air started to cool as we got the fire going. The whole place had this odd stillness to it, like the forest was holding its breath. We cooked our dinner, roasted some sausages over the fire, and joked about the usual stuff. Work, life, the usual mundane stuff that makes a conversation feel normal. But something felt off. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but there was a sense of being watched. I noticed my friend Sarah glancing around every few minutes, her eyes darting into the shadows just beyond the firelight. "So," she said, looking down at her half-eaten sausage, "you want to pack it in and head back? This place is starting to creep me out." I didn't want to admit I felt the same way, but I couldn't shake the unease either. The forest felt too quiet, too still. It was almost like everything had just gone silent. There was no breeze, no rustling leaves, no distant calls from animals. Just stillness. I turned to her, trying to act casual. "Nah, we're fine. Just being paranoid. It's a quiet night, that's all. Let's enjoy it." She wasn't convinced. "Yeah, right," she said, raising an eyebrow. "Let's stay in the creep woods and see what happens. Hope no creepy people show up." She chuckled, but it didn't sound like her usual laugh. It had this nervous edge to it, like she was trying to mask something. I felt that same uneasy tension creeping up my spine. It wasn't just the isolation, it was something else. Something that made the back of my neck prickle. We sat in silence for a few more minutes, watching the flames dance. The shadows seemed to grow longer, the night getting darker around us. I stared into the fire, trying to ignore the feeling in the pit of my stomach. Then out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. Just inside the ring of firelight, barely visible, something moved. At first I thought it was just a trick of the light, but then it shifted again, and I saw a figure. A man, standing just out of reach of the light, like he was trying to stay hidden in the dark. My heart slammed into my chest and I shot up from my seat, knocking the camp chair over in the process. "What the hell?" I whispered, voice barely above a breath. Sarah jumped up too, her eyes wide. "What is it?" I didn't say anything. I couldn't. My eyes were fixed on the figure in the shadows. The man froze, and for a moment, I thought maybe it was some kind of trick, like a shadow or some animal I was mistaken for a person. But no, it was a man. He was standing still, like he was trying to blend in with the trees. I couldn't see his face, but I could tell he wasn't just a passerby. The way he moved, how slow and deliberate it was, didn't feel natural. I stood there frozen as he let out a long, deep sigh. It wasn't like a relieved sigh. It was heavy, almost like he had been holding his breath for a long time. It felt wrong, too wrong. Then he slowly started to back away, inching out of the firelight, blending into the trees like he wasn't even there. "Get the car," I muttered, my voice tight. My pulse was pounding in my ears and the adrenaline hit me like a wave. My legs were shaking as I backed up toward the campsite, never taking my eyes off the dark spot where he had been. Sarah didn't hesitate. She turned and bolted toward the car, her footsteps pounding in the dirt. I followed as fast as I could, heart racing, my eyes darting over my shoulder every few seconds. The woods felt suffocating, pressing in from all sides. We made it to the car, and I slammed the door behind me, locking it. I glanced through the window, heart still hammering in my chest. The woods were silent again. Too silent. "Did you see that?" Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. She was still panting, her breath quick and shallow. I nodded, not trusting my voice. I didn't know what to say. I didn't want to say anything. The man, or whatever he was, had been real, and he was still out there, somewhere in those trees. We didn't speak after that, not a word. We sat there, huddled in the car, the engine running just in case we needed to leave in a hurry. The night stretched on, but we didn't feel safe enough to sleep. Every noise, every snap of a twig made us jump. Every shadow in the corner of our eyes had us looking over our shoulders. We kept the car locked and the lights on, and when the first light of dawn finally broke through the trees, we wasted no time getting the hell out of there. I never saw that man again, never heard anything about him. It was like he just disappeared, swallowed up by the woods. Thanks for watching. Don't leave before leaving a like to this video. Also hit the subscribe button to support my work. And as always, have a horrific nightmare, my dear.